The jeers and sneers from his cousins and uncles had only pushed him onward. He'd done it, tripled his remaining lifespan, and achieved a new level of power. He'd made it. His first act had been to try tapping into his family's bloodline once more. The clone ability had always eluded him, but perhaps now, with his newly strengthened core, things would be different. As he fought to open his eyes, he was greeted by a strange sight. A creature with humanoid features, but certainly not human, stood before him. Its skin was pale as milk, its eyes pitch black, resembling obsidian orbs that glimmered with an emotion Percy couldn't quite discern. Worry, perhaps? His skin was smooth as porcelain. What's happening? Who are these people? He tried to speak, to ask a question, but no sound emerged. Breath was forced into his lungs and, though it hurt, it kept him conscious. Barely. Scanning his surroundings, he noticed the walls were sleek, made of some polished material. They definitely didn't have anything of the sort back on Remir. Strange decorations adorned the room. There was a painting that seemed to have been drawn in 3 directions. Somehow, through the window, he glimpsed 3 suns, green, yellow, and blue, illuminating a turquoise sky. At any other time, Percy might have appreciated the novelty of the situation. Now, however, it only brought him unease. Desperately, he turned to the only source of familiarity he could think of, his status tab. He summoned it, hoping it still worked. Unauthorized usage. This narrative is on Amazon without the author's consent. Report any sightings. Guhat, Percival's clone. What the hell? His relief at being able to check his status was quickly replaced by shock. Guhat was probably the name given to this body, but what did it mean by Percival's clone? Wasn't he the real Percy? Wait, clone? I succeeded? Under other circumstances, he would be ecstatic. His family had given him a ton of grief over his inability to use it. Everyone, Percy included, thought he simply hadn't inherited it. But this wasn't how it was supposed to work. Fueled by their life affinity, the Avalon House's bloodline allowed them to cultivate a biological copy of themselves to delegate dangerous or tedious tasks to. Did I inherit a mutated version? Or is it because I don't have the life affinity? Percy had never been sure of his affinity. The standard test at age 5 had shown nothing, but there was a slim chance he had a rare affinity it couldn't detect. Of course, better tests existed, but his family hadn't thought it worth the resources on a red core like him. Let's see what I'm dealing with here, he thought, focusing on his status once more. Guhat, Percival's clone. Mana cores. Mana core 1, red. Mana core 2, red. Grants access to your status. Grants a second mana core. What? Losing his orange core stung given how long it took to get there. But it made sense since he was in a new, infant body. 2 cores, on the other hand? He'd never heard of anyone possessing more than 1. Well, that wasn't quite right. Percy had never heard of a human possessing multiple cores, but he did vaguely recall a rumor of an alien race famous for precisely that. What were they called? Manhwa somethings? He couldn't remember the exact name, but they stood out even among the countless species the divine order protected his world from. Now, I get to be one of them? His eyes almost sparkled with hope, but he quickly quashed the optimism. What was he thinking? He was just a botched clone who wouldn't survive much longer. His new body barely functioned. He couldn't even breathe without assistance. Everything hurt, and he felt himself beginning to collapse. Even if he survived, both his cores were red, leaving him at the bottom of the pecking order here as well. No, I can't give up so easily. He didn't care he was just a clone. He didn't care his cores were red. He had to fight with what he had, to live with what he had, to make the most of what he had. But sometimes sheer will wasn't enough. The air affinity spell was beginning to hurt more than it helped. As Guhat's eyes closed, the blurry silhouettes of the couple he guessed were his parents faded, their distraught cries replaced by silence. His final thought was a bitter one. I'm sorry for putting you guys through this. Percy was pulled towards a certain direction. It was as if a tight rope was glued to his back, forcing him to travel, to plunge through a seemingly infinite darkness, unable to resist. Couldn't tell how long it took. Maybe a week, a year, a century. Either way, his mind was murky, his thoughts failing to fully form. Perhaps this was purgatory, his punishment for casting that ability. It's not like he'd known what it would bring, but he appeared destined to pay the price all the same. At least it wasn't so bad. He was at peace. The pain was gone. Until it wasn't. A throbbing headache was the first new sensation, followed by warmth. He instinctively took a breath and then another and a third, ecstatic to have functioning lungs again. Next, he tried prying his eyes open, but his sight was blocked by something wet. Towel? He tried lifting his hands, but his limbs were weak. In the end, he shrugged, or he would have if he could. Instead, he just remained in that position, enjoying the rhythmic sound of his own heartbeat. Did they manage to fix me? He opened his status again, but what greeted him wasn't at all what he expected. Percival Avalon Mana Cores. Mana Core 1, orange. Mana Core 2, seed. Bloodline. Clone. Create a copy of yourself. Effect varies by affinity. Grants access to your status. Grants a bloodline. bloodline. A. Fractured. Grants the seed of a second mana core. Acquires potent life and mind mana to germinate. Holy shit. The shock somehow gave him the energy to sit up, the wet towel falling from his face. Glancing around, he found he was back in his room. His human body. No Guhat or Percival's clone? I guess the clone's memories return to me when it dies. More importantly, there it is. My orange core is back. Also, the clone bloodline. This was Percy's first time seeing his bloodline listed in his status. Just hadn't known. The status page wasn't omniscient. The only things it could detect through the simple test most kids underwent at age 5 were the starting grade of one's mana core and the common elemental affinities. As for rarer affinities and bloodlines, those required a more specialized investigation, which was only reserved for kids lucky to be born at orange or higher. The rest had to either earn enough money to pay for the test or to slowly discover their affinities and bloodline, if they even had any on their own. But what is this section with the question marks? He frowned. He had never seen or heard of anything like that. Still, most of its contents weren't new. Sections seemed to contain 3 separate items. One was access to the status itself, which everyone had. Another was the access to his bloodline. It appeared to be like a hidden section. Did it become visible because I brought this other thing back? This narrative has been purloined without the author's approval. Report any appearances on Amazon. Percy wasn't sure what to make of this. He seemed to have partially retained the unique trait of the alien body, but not the complete version. His second core was in a dormant state at a grade below even red. He wasn't sure if it could be salvaged. Either way, this is good. His core had advanced to orange, and it turned out he did have clone despite what everyone told him. Finally, he probably had a rare affinity too. At least, he couldn't imagine doing what he'd done with pure mana. Even if I can't get the second core to work, I'm still better off than before. Not that he wouldn't try, of course. He was about to make a mental checklist of things he needed to do when the door opened. "Percy!" a female voice yelled. His ears were sensitive, the shout giving him a buzz. Still, he barely raised his arms to shield himself from the incoming aquamarine-haired missile. "It's all right, Elaine. I'm all right." The girl hugging him, Elaine, was the only member of his family who didn't treat him like shit. Naturally, it gave her some sway with their grandpa. "What do you mean you're all right?" she yelled. "I found you on the floor. You've been out cold for a week. I had to use my water magic to feed you soup." Percy raised an eyebrow. He hadn't quite realized he'd been unconscious for so long. Felt a pang of guilt for worrying her, but also a fuzzy feeling in his chest. If it wasn't for Elaine, they'd have probably left him alone to die. That's assuming they even realized he was missing. "I'm sorry. I tried to use clone upon advancing, and it had a weird interaction with my affinity." Elaine let go of him, covering her mouth in surprise. "Advancing?" she asked as she closed her eyes, trying to sense his mana. "Oh my god, you've reached orange." Percy rolled his eyes at her reaction. He knew she was just happy for him, but it wasn't that strange he had advanced. Most people took about 10 years for their first promotion, so reaching orange at 15 was pretty much expected of him. If anything, nobles typically had access to resources doubling their purification speed. All his cousins had advanced at 10. Sadly, those resources weren't abundant enough to be wasted on lowly reds. The world of Remir was a cruel one, where the talented were showered with resources, letting them grow even faster, while the rest were left in the dust. Elaine, who was roughly the same age as him, had already advanced to green years ago. In any case, it was only a few seconds later that she seemed to grasp the rest of what he'd said. "Wait, you said you have clone and an affinity. I told Grandpa to test you properly before writing you off." "Yeah, right." As if Baldy would waste a copper on his worst grandkid. Percy chuckled. Lane flicked his forehead, causing him to wince. "Stop calling him that. I know he needs to start treating you better, but this isn't helping." Percy wanted to protest that it was just a shorthand for the guy's name. Archibald. Baldy. Also, he didn't have a single hair on his head, so it fit, but they'd had that conversation before, and he was too tired to get into it again. In the end, he shrugged. "Well, this is all wonderful news." Wasn't just optimism speaking. Bloodlines were hereditary. Occasionally, somebody would fail to inherit one from their parents, and on even rarer occasions their bloodline would mutate into a new direction. Still, for the most part, they were passed along intact. Affinities were less hereditary. Sometimes one would inherit one from their parents. Other times they wouldn't, but there were exceptions. The clone bloodline his family possessed was strongly correlated with the rare life affinity. Most members of the Avalon house tended to inherit both, while few got neither. It was a potent combination which made their family one of the stronger noble houses, even though they lacked a white core. Still, there had been instances over the centuries when individuals would be born with the clone bloodline and a different affinity. And there had even been cases where people had the bloodline and no affinity, but no other combination ever did anything noteworthy. The only explanation for Percy's misadventure was that he had an affinity uncertainty never before seen in his family. Then we need to ask Grandpa to get you a proper test, Elaine said, grabbing him by the forearm. He nearly stumbled as he was pulled, his legs still a bit wobbly, but he managed to follow her without falling. Truth be told, Percy wasn't exactly thrilled at the prospect of asking his grandpa for a favor. The man had never deigned to give him anything, despite the rosier version of him in Elaine's head. Still, he needed to figure out what his affinity was before he could even begin to understand how to use it. If he had to pay for the test himself, it would take him several more years, as he had already used up his savings for his advancement. Potent source of life mana, huh? I bet that qualifies. Come in, an authoritative voice said. Elaine opened the door, dragging Percy behind her. The two found a man sitting at his desk. The afternoon sun reflected off the top of his head. Despite his shaved scalp, he didn't look old. His appearance was that of a burly man still in his late 20s, even though he had lived for centuries. Grandpa, the girl said, clearly eager to share the good news. Archibald lifted his eyes, his gaze briefly lingering on Percy, before it returned to the documents he was reading. The latter rolled his eyes, realizing this was already a lost cause, but his cheerful cousin didn't seem ready to give up just yet. He bit her lower lip for a moment before speaking again. Grandpa, Percy is okay. The answer is no. The man cut her short. Just hear me out. He has managed to, Elaine. Archibald stopped her again. I can tell he's at Orange. It doesn't matter. It doesn't change anything. You know that already. The girl deflated, looking down at her feet. On Remier, the most important trait determining one's achievements in life was the grade of their mana core at birth. Sure, one could continue to advance throughout their lives, but each promotion was exponentially more difficult than the one before. The first typically required about a decade, the second a century, the third a millennium, and so on. Having access to more valuable resources could have each of those milestones, of course, but that didn't affect the way they scaled. At the same time, each subsequent grade typically tripled one's physical and magical ability, as well as their remaining lifespan. Somebody who spent their whole life at Red would only live about 80 years at most, while somebody at Orange would get 240. Naturally, this meant that somebody like Percy would never get to Green in his life. Having reached Orange at 15, he could maybe hope to reach Yellow by 115 and then remain stuck at that level until he died of old age at 400. Even if his grandpa decided to treat him to the same resources his cousins had access to and he reached Yellow by 65, he would only live to about 500, which wouldn't be enough for the next grade. By comparison, somebody born at Orange, just one grade above Percy, could potentially live for thousands of years and reach all the way to Blue 2 grades above him. As for those born at Yellow like Elaine and Archibald, they could even reach Violet and White, living up to 40,000 years. Percy's grandpa was already at Violet, having lived for over 700 years, but he still had several millennia of lifespan left as well as the hope of reaching White. For the first time since the two walked into the room, Archibald raised his eyebrows. He tossed another look at his grandson, this time not so quick to dismiss him. You've used clone? He asked. Percy nodded. Actually used it? There have been others without the life affinity in the past, but water clones and pure clones just disperse. Archibald asked again. It definitely did something interesting. As for what exactly, I don't fully understand it yet. His grandpa furrowed his brow at the implications, noticing that Elaine was over the moon. See, even if Percy can't become too powerful himself, his kids could start a new branch of the family. We should invest in him. Archibald tapped his fingers on the mahogany desk for a few seconds, seemingly lost in thought. What you said makes some sense. I've never had another useful affinity paired with clone. If the new bundle is truly useful and easy to pass on, it could indeed be good for the family, he said. However, that doesn't mean we should spend cultivation resources on Percy. 400 years are more than enough for him to sire plenty of children. He doesn't need to be stronger to do that. Percy gritted his teeth. As much as he would have liked those resources, he was more annoyed by the callousness of his grandpa, treating him more like an asset than family. Still, he had agreed to follow Elaine here for a reason, so he didn't let it get to him as he spoke again. I don't want your cultivation resources. I'm only asking for a better affinity test. After all, that can help us both figure out how the bloodline works in my case. As they walked back to his room, he replayed the conversation in his mind, his hands balled into fists, drained of all color. Faced with his grandfather's coldness, Percy had come this close to spilling the beans on his second mana core. He so wanted to see Baldy's face twist as he learned the grandson he treated like trash had achieved something no human ever had. Not the white cores, not even the lofty existences in the divine order could boast of such a feat. He had stolen the most important secret of one of the strongest races in the universe. He had done that with a worthless orange core, but he'd held himself back. First of all, it sounded quite unbelievable, and he couldn't exactly prove it. Speaking of the event might have made his grandpa think he was lying about the whole thing and robbed him of the affinity test. More importantly, he owed him nothing. If it wasn't for Elaine, Elaine, he would have left this shitty family already. Whatever his second core meant for him, he would discover on his own and forge his own path. His biggest regret was that he needed to get close to his grandpa's treasured tree. It was his family's most prized possession, and he hoped it was precisely the potent source of life mana he needed to germinate the seed. Let's leave if for now. If Baldy was so stingy with the affinity test and the cultivation resources, there's no chance he'd let me anywhere near the tree in a million years. But it didn't matter. He knew where it was. He could figure out a way to sneak there later. Besides, he still needed to find a source of mind mana for this to work. Thinking of something, he grinned. As it so happened, the advanced affinity test would be held at precisely such a place. The duo were about to enter Percy's room, but he stopped at the entrance. This caused Elaine to look at him in concern. Percy, don't let this get to you. If your affinity is really useful, we can convince him to give you more resources later. Chuckled. It's not that. I've just realized that I haven't even tried practicing with my core since it evolved. Between everything that happened with the bloodline, I never got the chance. As he was about to head to the training grounds, she grabbed his arm again. Seriously, you were in a coma for a week, and we are about to head out in a couple of days. What you need right now is to get some rest. Percy looked her in the eyes as his lips curled and parted. Smiling, he said, thanks. Seeing her forehead crease in confusion, he hurriedly added, for caring. You're the only one who does. But I still need to do this. And he walked away, leaving her behind. It was true he could use some sleep. His mind was still exhausted, his body weak, but he had to get stronger soon. He understood there weren't many people he could rely on. No handouts for him. Everything he needed, he had to fight for. Soon, he reached the training grounds. Just a section of the garden, really. He briefly paused to appreciate the birds chirping on the trees and the squirrels bolting up and down their trunks. Then, he walked to the middle of the grass, facing a wide, dead oak tree that people typically used for target practice. Nobody else was around right now. His cousins rarely trained. They were mostly content lazing around and gulping expensive elixirs that cleansed their cores and lengthened their lives. They didn't need to practice their magic to be stronger than the likes of him. Shaking the irritating thoughts away, he raised his palm towards the aged trunk and willed his mana to accumulate in his hand. He held it until the pressure in both his core and mind became unbearable, and then he released it. A faint distortion phased through the tree but didn't do much else. Percy wasn't exactly surprised. His unknown affinity had done nothing back at Red, besides giving people a slight chilling sensation. Was to the point that nobody was sure he even had an affinity back then. But he now knew he did, so he was determined to make it count. He gathered more mana, this time holding it a moment longer and trying to condense it even further before firing. Still didn't do anything, but he didn't care. Again, he kept firing, bolt after bolt, minute after minute, hour after hour. Every so often, he would take a break to refill his core before resuming his practice. The time he fell to his knees, the sun had already set. He had practiced as long as he could, and then some, but it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. Not yet. They all looked down on him. He didn't care about most of them. He was used to it by now, but he cared that Elaine looked down on him. Unlike the others, she didn't do it on purpose. She didn't do it maliciously. She did it all the same. She had been surprised he had reached Orange at 15, as if it was some great achievement. He had pushed him to beg for scraps from their grandpa, and it stung so fucking much, but he'd never given up on himself. He was the only one who knew. His heart too thrummed with ambition, and one day he would show them. He would show them all. Let's just get this over with, a man seemingly in his 20s said as he climbed on his horse. His hair was a light blue color, like Elaine's. His face sported 8 or 9 points of similarity to hers too. He was Gawain, her father. It was the inevitable consequence of being born at Orange and having a child more talented than he was. That, coupled with the fact his branch of the family hadn't inherited the bloodline, meant his status had only ever been slightly higher than the likes of Percy. At least until Elaine came along. He'd never talked much, and it wasn't like Gawain had ever particularly shown any care for him, but at least he wasn't among the crowd mistreating him either. He was still tired, of course, having trained relentlessly over the last 3 days, but the thought of finally learning his affinity after being in the dark his whole life was invigorating. Not to mention the other thing waiting for me there, he grinned. You seem to be in good spirits today. Elaine chirped as her horse neared his. Well, your highness, us lowborns don't get to leave the house very often, he chuckled. This earned him a casual punch in the shoulder. He rubbed the injured area in an exaggerated manner. Made it seem like a joke, but truth be told, it did hurt some. Elaine had 2 grades on him, which translated to a 9-fold advantage in physical strength. Even a light tap from her felt heavier than she realized. See if you're still as cheery after 2 weeks on horseback, she replied with a smile of her own. Soon they entered a forest. It smelled fresh, especially to Percy, who hadn't ever breathed anything other than the stale air of the mansion. On each each side of the path, he saw rows upon rows of tall and wide pine trees, their cones a strange oblong shape, their surface filled with small holes. Every now and then, a gentle breeze would blow, causing them to emit soft high-pitched sounds. It was precisely this unique variety of trees which made the Whistling Woods famous in the region. Only when the sun began to set did Gawain stop, gesturing at them to help him set up camp. They'd have to spend 4 nights in the forest, and another 2 along the grasslands on the other side, before reaching the foot of the mountain where the temple was located on the 7th. "Uncle, how safe are these woods even?" Percy asked, as he gazed at the imposing trees which already looked much scarier than they had just minutes ago. Stolen from Royal Road, this story should be reported if encountered on Amazon. Gawain chuckled. "Don't worry, kid. Most dangerous thing we can run into is a pack of wood goblins. A simple crude spell from a green core can easily kill a whole bunch of them." Percy looked at his grinning cousin, his uncle's words reminding him that the innocent-looking girl was really a little monster in disguise. Percy was too weak to take a shift by himself. If they were ambushed, he might not be able to do much before waking the others. Most animals on Remir, even the ones which didn't possess magic of their own, had evolved the ability to sense another's mana core, mostly to avoid danger. "Geez, she fell asleep again." Percy rolled his eyes. While Elaine had been a bit tense at the beginning, she had noticeably relaxed over the past few nights. This was the second time she dozed off an hour before their shift ended. He felt bad waking her up, especially since nothing would happen most likely. Still, he knew he couldn't protect the group by himself on the off chance it did. He didn't even hear his own voice. Come to think of it, even the whistling sound of the wind passing through the trees seemed to have gone silent. He frowned. Nothing. He felt his vocal cords vibrate, but not a sound came out of his mouth. Paling, he darted towards her, hoping to shake his cousin awake. Arrow landed soundlessly just in front of his foot, stopping him in his tracks. Another soon followed, this one whizzing by him, nicking him in the shoulder. Turning to look in the direction the projectiles had been fired from, he only spotted several pairs of bright yellow eyes glinting in the darkness. Shit, he thought right as a third arrow hit him in the thigh. Gritting his teeth, he resumed his dash to Elaine. He was only 4 meters away, though they now felt longer as he limped, barely dodging the 4th arrow by accident. He was about to reach her when the 5th arrow hit his other calf, sending him tumbling on the dirt. Normally, the sound should have woken her up as he was only half a meter away, but something was still muting all noise in the area. Percy stretched his arm, trying to reach her foot as he noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. Turning his head, he saw a silhouette standing over him. It wasn't very tall, probably shorter than he was. Still, the savage look in its eyes, coupled with the glint of its weapon's edge, some kind of hatchet most likely, were enough to convince him of the danger it posed. As if by instinct, he turned his palm the way of the creature, repeating the same move he'd been practicing over the days leading to the trip. He hurled the mana a second sooner than he would have liked. While he could have charged it some more, he had to stop his assailant before it swung its weapon. Not even waiting to see if it had any effect, he reached for his cousin, this time succeeding. Girl's eyes snapped open, as did her mouth. She tried to scream, but he couldn't hear her. Luckily, she regained her wits a moment later. Just in time too, as she was already surrounded by 3 more of the fiends. Another spell sent a bucket full of water splashing over her father, waking him up. Phew! Percy let out a breath he hadn't even noticed he was holding, as his relatives rounded up the remaining goblins. Creatures tried to run away, of course, but their short legs couldn't possibly outrun a green-cored humans. Only now did he take the time to examine the arrows sticking out of his flesh.